Доброго дня, шановні пані та панове. Український кризовий медіа-центр розпочинає робочий день, і ми вітаємо всіх.
We start our working day. We greet everyone who watches here and online. The topic of today's briefing is the electoral process in the occupied territory of Crimea and Donbass and how to take this experience into account, the experience of Moldova and Georgia. Good afternoon, everyone. Those who watch us here and online, we thank all the participants for joining us. And first of all, I would like to say that we are going to speak Russian because our research covered several countries, including Moldova and Georgia. And the representatives of these countries, they participate in our conference in order not to lose something in translation. We believe that we should be carrying out discussion in Russian. So I greet our colleagues from Tbilisi and Chisinau and from Kiev, and part of us is here, part of us is online. And briefly, I would like to introduce our research, and then I will provide the floor to the donors who helped us. This is the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and then we'll have a discussion. So we surveyed and had the research how to safely and beneficially for the country to involve citizens into election process in the territories that are not controlled by the state. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not the only country who faced this problem. Moldova and Georgia, they also have territories that are not under the control of the government. We decided to study the situation and how they deal with these issues in Moldova and Georgia. This is briefly about what we do. Now I give the floor to the representative of Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and then we will follow our discussion. Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. I am glad to greet you here on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. This is a political fund and that is close to German party, Christian Democratic Union. Nevertheless, we are independent. Konrad Adenauer Foundation started its work in Ukraine in 1994, and in 2017 we opened office in Kharkiv, and I represent this office. Konrad Adenauer Foundation deals with different areas of activity, such as development of legal state, democracy, market economy, culture, heritage, and many other issues. And you may find more information on our site and on our Facebook page. This research was carried out and supported by Konrad Adenauer Foundation in the framework of the project and contest concerning Eastern Partnership of the European Union. I'm really glad that this research was implemented despite different situations such as we lack time and also problems with international flights and traveling on the whole. I thank Mr. Sydorenko, Mr. Panchenko, and Natalia Ishchenko, analyst, also all the team of Europeiska Pravda. I would like to say that today we will mention such words as democracy, elections. Often these notions are interrelated. They are something simple for understanding for the people. But democracy is not only about participation and possibility to elect people. In authoritarian countries, we know that they hold elections, and this is just a facade. In such a way, they legitimize authoritarian rule. And this is also about representation of people in power, and elections also may be full-fledged and democratic only in case if the rights of voters are adhered to. There should not be any discrimination of any groups, and there should be competitive and transparent process, electoral campaign, and there should not be any falsification of elections. We all have seen that even in developed democracies, there are many manipulations during elections that influence the result of the elections. We have seen it in US in 2016 and in Great Britain in 2016, and about countries that only start their way to democracy. We should take into account experience of Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, countries that deal with the Russian aggression, and they have the territories that are not under control of the government. The elections are difficult in such cases. Such processes are difficult. Often, it is difficult to understand how to include those citizens who live in non-controlled territories, how to hold these elections in non-controlled territories. And the last option is not realistic. And such experiences lacking in Moldova and Georgia. And participation of citizens from the occupied territories in Moldova and Georgia. This was represented in this research. I would like to speak about the research now. I would like to give the floor to our experts, and they will tell you about the threats and whether it is possible to hold such processes there. Now we are going to present our research. Now briefly about the participants of discussion, who is going to participate in today's discussion. Alexei introduced this team, 3 people on the team. We also got consultations from our international partners. Also, we got the opinion of Ukrainian expert and about the authors. Serhiy Sydorenko, Yuriy Panchenko, my colleague. We are editors of European Pravda, and also Natalia Ishchenko, and she's here with us online. And from Moldova, we have Pavel Postika, Promo-LEX organization that deal with elections and non-controlled territories issues. This is the expert in 2 key areas of our research. From Georgia, we have Zakareishvili, ex-minister on reconciliation and civil liberties, civil equality. Olga Aivazovska, head of the board of OPORA NGO, and she is going to comment on our ideas concerning legislation and election regulations. Also expert on Donbass, Zolkina, Ilko, Kucheriv, Democratic Initiative Foundation, and through Zoom we have Tamila, Tasheva, deputy head of Ukraine, and she knows the situation in Crimea really well, and she's going to tell us about Crimea situation in Crimea. She is a deputy permanent representative of the president of Ukraine in Crimea. And Yuriy will tell us about Georgia, and Natalia will sum up, and then we will have discussion what we can do about it and what we should take into account here in Ukraine. About Moldova.
Now, about Moldova. In November, in Moldova, we had 2 rounds of elections. Those elections were very closely traced in Ukraine, followed up in Ukraine, and they had become a demonstration of a short period when the Transnistria residents actively participated. Moldova is a small country where 1.5 million voters are registered. At the same time, almost 8% of them are registered in Transnistria, which has the status of the occupied territory. And during all the period of the Moldovan independence, the discussions had been held about the possibility to allow those residents, those citizens, to participate in the elections. By the year 2016, the Transnistria had been participating rather passively, but since 2016 they started to act more energetically, and now more than 2% of total number of voters was almost 2%. And in case the gap between 2 candidates were smaller, there might be the threat for democratic forces to be grasped by the non-democratic forces. But our system is slightly different from the Ukrainian one. Our residents can register for voting either via email or by post or personally, and vote. At the how the residents from the occupied territories can vote. They can go to the contact line, and along the contact line on the controlled territory there are special voting posts, that is special polling stations, allowing people who cross the contact line to come and to vote on the voting day. So on the voting day we experience a very vivid movement via the border, via the contact line, and very proactive voting. Of course, we tried to study the process, whether this system could be abused. What else is different in Moldova? In Moldova we do not have IDPs because we never had a big wave of internally displaced people from Transnistria, and those people who come to vote on the polling stations and voting day, they are either registered as residents of Transnistria or they are registered as the voters from mainland Moldova, so to say. Now I'm giving the floor to my colleagues to describe the voting process in Georgia. Unfortunately, we were not lucky during these elections in Georgia to observe the standard situation because of the pandemic. The checkpoints between Georgia and Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia, they remain beyond the border and were unable to cross the contact line, but they were able to participate in the previous elections. Unlike Moldova, Georgia has chosen slightly different paths. During parliamentary elections in Moldova, Transnistria residents can participate in the one-mandate constituencies, and thus the value of participation for voters in Moldova is higher when they vote for the MPs. In Ukraine, in Russia, in Ukraine and Georgia, the pre-border territories cannot vote for the members of parliament. And unlike in Transnistria, unlike in Ukraine, voting in Georgia is not massive. The conflict in Georgia is based on ethnical grounds, and that's why those people who want to vote in the occupied Southern Ossetia, these are people with Georgian passports, and they are ethnic Georgians, and they're not very numerous, so to say. Then in Georgia, we observe that in the public opinion there is feeling that the votes of Georgians from South Ossetia are manipulated, and those people, those voters, are used to participate in the distortion of the results, that is, to participate in a sort of carousel, etc., to change the results of the elections. It's doubtful that this opinion is true, but nevertheless, it is widely used. And for Ukraine, it's a good warning that in case we will have similar rules in Ukraine, in case we accept the similar rules in Ukraine, then we inevitably will face the same stereotype, which will very rapidly develop. With this, I would like to give the floor to Natalia. Can you hear me? Well, major outcomes from our research was that Ukraine will face the problem how to ensure, how to secure participation for the voters in the occupied territories. The problem is existent now, but now it is not that massive because in Crimea and in Orlo, we have many residents with Ukrainian passports, and in general, those people in principle, they have the right to vote, and based on the legislation, Ukraine should not make any obstacles for them. And what we have found that ensuring this right to the residents of occupied territories is extremely difficult. On the one hand, it is not so easy to organize opportunity for those people to arrive to the polling station along the contact line. Although this is quite possible, but the risks are nevertheless high. This means that residents of non-controlled territories are in unequal situation in comparison with the residents of mainland Ukraine. They have very, very limited access to information. They are unable to see the full spectrum of the candidates. They have no access to political pluralism. They cannot enjoy the freedom of speech. The candidates are unable to enter the occupied territories and to present the political positions. Neither in Georgia nor in Transnistria the candidates are not prevented from this. In Ukraine, the candidates have no access to the occupied territories. The second big risk is the inability to enforce the election legislation. That is, in the occupied territories, Ukraine actually has no law enforcement agencies, has no observers, nothing actually. When we hear in Transnistria that there were bribes given to voters, that carousels happened, etc., in Moldova it is not possible to investigate the breaches of legislation and violations during elections. The same is happening in Georgia. It is not possible to investigate, it is not possible for Tbilisi to investigate the cases of breaches during elections. So when people have no access to information to make a well-informed decision, the first, and the second, when they have no freedom of speech, and the second, that voters who are not protected from the abuse of voting right, that is, they are not protected from breaches of election legislation. And the third, that residents of occupied territories may come and should come for voting on the mainland country. In Moldova, we witnessed how people from non-controlled territories had physical conflicts with residents of controlled territories, and the law enforcement officers immediately stopped them. While in Moldova the conflict is much frozen and cold, so to say, while in Donbass the conflict is in a hot stage, so to say, and there is a big threat for both sides, for residents at the both sides, when the non-residents arrive, and when those who arrive for voting, they are under threat again. In Moldova, we experienced when those people from Transnistria who had voted in previous elections in the territory of Moldova, then they were persecuted by their neighbors when they came back to Transnistria. The same may happen here in Ukraine. All these are issues which immediately arise when we start thinking about elections. Although issues, they fall within the scope of all the international documents and the principles of international documents, the OSCE recommendations and etc. So how to ensure the rights for voters in the occupied territories? This is a huge question which should be resolved jointly with international organizations. The objective of our study was not just looking at the elections on the occupied territories, but we tried to understand the functioning of the voting system in the occupied territories, and we found out that neither Georgia nor Moldova held any elections on the occupied territories themselves. All the voting happens on the mainland Ukraine. I would like to comment. Natalka is an IDP from Abkhazia, and she was born in Abkhazia, and she came from Abkhazia, and she is familiar with the problem, and although now Natalka is a patriot of Ukraine and has been living here for a long time, but nevertheless she is very much involved into the problem. And now I would like to ask Alexei, what is your opinion on the research, and also the question to you as an employee of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I understand that you deal with elections. For you, it is important to involve as many voters as possible into democratic process of elections. On the other hand, you follow up the situation in Transnistria, and you know how difficult it is to stack with the freedom of choice and with the preservation of standards. How do you balance the need to vote and the need to balance the interests? Pavel, the floor is yours. Pavel is from Promo-LEX organization. Perhaps, thank you for invitation. Perhaps I will start from the answer to the last question. Quite often we rely on the existing legislation, but saying this, we fully realize that the right to elect and the right to be elected is not the absolute right, even according to the international standards. And we all realize that in practice some limitations may exist, and some of those limitations may be the result from the absent or insufficient control over territories where voters live, where voters reside, including those residents who remain abroad. That's why the category of voters who are beyond the direct influence of the governmental authorities, they should realize that their right to vote is limited, naturally limited. That's why when we start election campaigns or public awareness campaigns to inform the people from occupied territories how they can vote in the non-occupied territory, in mainland territory of the country. This is only information, that is to inform them where to go on the election day, how to register for voting, where to find information about the candidates campaigning for election. That's why this year, being in the midst of a pandemic, we opened online information agencies providing all possible online information to ensure that people have at least minimal information what's going on, but keeping in mind that interest to the elections had grown considerably several times, beginning from 2016. 2016, 2019, and this year the presidential elections. We understand that this is a result of two factors. We have noticed the facts of organized carousels and bribing of voters for participation in these carousels. We have experienced that investigation of those cases is quite difficult, and law enforcement agencies unfortunately do not sometimes do not even try to do this, and the splash of interest to elections, to participation in elections, is the result of removed obstacles from the leadership of Transnistria, and sometimes they even allowed to the Transnistria residents to vote in Moldavian elections. Although by 2016, the Transnistrian authorities tried to create huge obstacles for residents trying to vote in Moldova. But if we think about goodwill vote, we should look at the preliminary registration we observed several dozens of thousands of voters out of more than 250 and the voluntary registration, voluntary and preliminary registration for voting, between 4,000-7,000 of voters. Everything which is more than this figure, this is this might be the result of corruption, of bribery, of carousels, etc. To compare, for a broad voting, we had some 60,000 of registered people, while 250,000 voted. Another detail, those people who crossed the contact line, who arrived on buses, on cars, on big vehicles, and had conflicts with those who tried to hinder the access for big vehicles. And Transnistria conflict is a conflict between two elites. And what we had seen during the first and second rounds of elections, when ordinary people tried to make obstacles for voters arriving. This is an important factor indicating that the conflict may go deeper from the level of two elites into the down to the level of ordinary people. This should be prevented, of course. That is what I wanted to mention as the specificities of the Moldavian process. Thank you, Pavel. Thank you for good focus. I would like to use this opportunity to promote our research. Today, after lunch, we will download it into the internet. I would like to mention that during last elections, we observed how ordinary people tried to prevent the voters from Transnistria to come and vote in the polling stations along the contact lines. This is an important new factor. And also Pavel had mentioned voters from abroad, which is slightly different from the occupied territories, because they are voluntarily staying in the foreign countries, but those people also are limited in their access to information about candidates, about campaign, etc. This shows that there is some connection, maybe indirect connection, between the level of information existent with occupied residents of occupied territories and residents from foreign countries who plan to vote. With this, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Paata Zakareishvili from Georgia. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. I will try to explain the specificities of Georgia. We truly rejected that the conflict in Georgia happened before the establishing the citizenship, and actually the Russians, Armenians, Abkhazians, they had received the citizenship of Russia, of Abkhazia first, and then the citizens of Russia. Those who have Georgian citizenship, these are up to 600 people. These are businessmen, and they need Georgian passports for trips to Turkey, etc. That is Georgian living in Abkhazia, especially in eastern Abkhazia. We even do not know who have Georgian passports. Because the names are very similar, and quite often they are registered as Abkhazians, not Georgians, and but ethnical Georgians living in Abkhazia, they have Georgian passports, and this may amount to 1/3 of today's Abkhazia. And they can travel freely. Unlike in southern Ossetia, Abkhazians may cross the border with Georgia, may travel across Georgia, and nobody wishes to deprive Abkhazian Georgians from their Georgian passports. Actually, this may result in deserting of Karpsky Rayon, of Karpsky district, where the majority are Georgians. And moreover, they are very obedient, compliant to the laws. They are very tolerant people, and actually, this is Abkhazia having more problems with Georgian elections and with participation of native Georgians in Georgian elections. When Georgians vote in Abkhazia, this is the bigger problem for Abkhazia. Sometimes they are limited in their rights. And when Georgians in Abkhazia have Abkhazian passports, they were able in the past to influence considerably the re-election results in Georgia. That's why the current authorities, the current president of that republic, had prohibited Georgians to participate in the Abkhazian elections, But actually 45,000 Georgian citizens, they are able to cross the border on election day and come from Karsky region, Karsky district to the to vote. Some of them are registered in Medgreli district or even Tbilisi. They are registered as voters in Georgia, and they have the same rights as citizens of the Georgia. At the stage of registration, they have double registration. They show two places of residence, that they are Georgian citizens registered in registered somewhere in Georgia, and they indicate their residence address in Abkhazia as their current permanent address of residence. And out of those 45,000 people, they come to Georgia to vote. In the numbers, which amount to 2/3 of these people, when Mikhail Saakashvili and his democratic movement in 2008, he organized buses to cross the border to come to vote. But now, when the authorities are changed, those residents are now not the object of political manipulations. And this year, due to pandemic, the borders are closed in Abkhazia, in southern Ossetia, and in Georgia. And those who wanted to vote had to cross the border 2 weeks prior to the elections. And then to experience 2 weeks lockdown upon return. That's why the residents of Karsky district did not participate in the elections this year, because there was double border lockdown on both sides. Without coronavirus, the border, the checkpoint would stay open, and those 30,000 which usually participate in the elections, they would cross the border. We also have the IDPs from Abkhazia who reside in Georgia, who are able to influence the results of Georgian elections. They do not have either political party. I always feel surprised why they do not create political party which would be able to bargain with other political leaders. So I believe that they having political party, they might be able to represent their interests. And by the way, Georgian authorities do not do much for IDPs from Abkhazia, and those people always vote for local authority which does at least something for them, maybe not much, but at least something. And the votes of those people are very loyal to local authorities. They try to preserve status quo, and for us, this is a sad situation because we think that those people should create their own political party and lobby for their political interests. Abkhazia would be happy to separate to have polling stations, Georgian polling station in the Karsky district, because they are not very happy when Georgians close the border to do something with Georgia. Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia are recognized as independent states by Russian Federation, and it prevents us from opening polling stations in those countries. As for the human rights, I am a human rights activist in the past, and human rights activists are never the past activists. I can assure you that the participation in elections is not the only human right which are violated in the occupied territories. They have bigger problems with the freedom of speech, with the freedom of movement, etc., which are the topical rights for them, unlike one voting day. Let the voting right be the biggest problem for that residents. Till now, many people cannot enjoy the property right. They cannot sell their property or re-register the property. Or children have no right to receive schooling in their mother tongue. Georgians, Armenians are prevented from training for getting schooling in their native language. These are primary rights which are very topical for local people, unlike the right to vote once in 5 years, etc. And even during pre-election campaign, we even say to people, if you feel threat, do not go to elections.
So we heard the experience of Moldova and Georgia. She's now in Tbilisi, believe that it is not acceptable to open polling stations in the occupied territories because of course, this is not direct legitimization, but it is indirect legitimization. Even those periods when in Moldova there was the power that was considered as pro-Russian, as I heard from different people, and just now they didn't allow this opportunity to agree with Tiraspol on opening these polling stations because this would be against the interest of Moldova, and Ukraine should take this experience into account. Now I would like to go to Ukrainian context. We start from Maria Zolkina. And we will speak about this experience and how we may implement it in Donbass, and then we will go to Tamila Tasheva. And then we will get comments on legislation from another expert. And please, thank you. I was listening to Paata, and I see that there is no statistical data and the results of some survey, but I believe that in Ukraine, a group of IDPs, they hardly vote for the power during elections, and this is a good aspect that say that Georgia, they do not have diplomatic success in returning the occupied territory, and they concentrated on internal policy concerning occupied territories and IDPs. And they focus on this, and in this way, indirectly, this is supported by the results of the elections. IDPs, they thank any power they get significant benefits from. And now about the problems of voting of residents of the occupied territories in the context of Donbass. Here I would like to speak about three key aspects. First, this is logistics and technical aspect, how it could look in the territory of Ukraine in Donbass. Second, about social sentiments. The topic of elections is obligatory, would influence public opinion. And the third aspect is how it will be used by Ukraine or by Russia in the context of negotiations in the Normandy format or in the Minsk trilateral contact group. I will start with logistics and technical aspect. In order to organize participation, mass participation, as it was in Transnistria, to have these elections in Ukraine, as we are speaking about Donbass, to bring people in mass from Donbass, logistically, it is nearly impossible because checkpoints are not able to have such mass transportations in on the day of elections. If we have a gap more than 0.5%, before quarantine in Donetsk Oblast, about 30,000+ of people crossed this line in different checkpoints. In Lugansk, it was about 10,000 to 12,000. And if we have a Shasty checkpoint, this will add about 15,000. And election day, for example, Russia may bring some people from the occupied territories to vote in controlled territories. This will be like the days of maximum load at checkpoints. Even in these days, in Donetsk Oblast, we will have 40,000+. We had such experience in Lugansk. It will be in Stanitsa Lugansk about 15 or 17,000. Theoretically, we are not able to transport more people through these checkpoints. There should be special steps made by Ukraine to open some special points, like it was in Transnistria. For example, people who want to vote in controlled territories, they do not go to some special polling stations. They change their registration, then they go to polling stations like everyone else. So legislation should be changed that would allow to come to these polling stations like in Transnistria, because we should register our place of residence beforehand now. And also, as I've said about checkpoints and their capacity, that should be increased, and many other things should be done. And so it is difficult to imagine how it could be done. So if Russian side would try to manipulate and would try to do it like in Moldova, when they don't try to create this mass participation in elections for the residents of Transnistria, in order to nullify these risks, we should not do anything. So now you may change your place of registration. You should register beforehand, cross the line on the day of voting in order to vote near the contact line at polling stations. So now this risk in this situation is not really high for the results of elections. It is not a threat. If, speaking roughly, 70,000 or 80,000 cross the line on the day of voting and all they go to vote, in Ukraine we have 33 million. Olga, please correct me. 29 million. So this is less than 1%. In any case, we should understand, and we should not believe that there will be a huge number of buses or cars. There are no trains from occupied territories. So logistically and practically, this is about the situation. Now about social sentiments. The influence of voting on the results of elections. During the last 5 years, we should be really careful about this. During the last 5 years, NGOs, activists, experts, including me, we carried out work in order to provide proper status for IDPs. They should have the right to vote in any elections without any problems, and this year they were able to participate in local elections. If now we start to say that this effect may be produced, and people from occupied territories, without any information, they come and vote and influence, and I would like to show that there may be a social wave of some alienation. We understand that we should be really careful about public opinion in this case. We should not make this problem bigger. Yes, there is a problem. The Russian Federation may use this problem. But the main message here, we should choose words carefully, because this may influence on the attitude concerning the citizens of the occupied territories, and we should preserve this loyal attitude to the citizens that live now in the occupied territories. How it can be used during negotiations. The Russian Federation may use this factor during negotiations. They will try to create an ambush for Ukrainian side. They may demand creation of special voting stations, like in Moldova. They may say that this is the territory of Ukraine with special status, and in the Normandy format or in the trilateral working group, they may call on this before the next elections. And then we would have to provide the answer about these conditions that we are going to create to expand this opportunity for the residents. Then the Russian side may condemn us. They may say that we forget about these people and we do not want to have a progress in negotiations. And I would like to repeat that before making some special steps, to help these people to vote, this problem won't be so acute. Sometimes there are situations in the state policy when the best solution is inaction, not to take any decision. I was thinking on the results of your research, and I believe that today, if we're speaking about Donbass, the only option when we may introduce some changes to legislation concerning elections or changes into the process, it can be done only if there are serious results of negotiations, for example, the stage of disarmament, presidential elections, serious results. Then, as a part of the process, until we return these territories, there may be some separate steps. Then more people from the occupied territories be able to come and vote in the controlled territory. If there are no such changes, if there is no proper integration, Ukrainian side won't be able to benefit from the situation, and the Ukrainian side should not play with these things, I believe. Thank you very much. Now Tamila Tasheva is given the floor, and please. Could you comment about such things concerning those people who live in Crimea or those who came from Crimea to the mainland Ukraine? Maybe they would like to have some representation in the parliament, like, for example, in Moldova, to have some mandates that are provided to these people based on majoritarian districts. And what ideas may be introduced by the occupants concerning Crimean? First of all, I would like to thank you for this research. For us, participation in elections is an important part of support of residents in the occupied territories. Their political rights are important, as well as their social rights and their rights and their property rights. There were elections in May 2014. There were good communications with these residents in Crimea and Sevastopol. People there were interested in elections that were ongoing. More than 6,000 people voted, residents of Crimea and IDPs from the territory of the Crimean Peninsula. More than 6,000 registered. In the result, less people voted. This was connected, firstly, and now this problem persists because they had to come twice from the territory of Peninsula. First, register, change the place of voting, and then go once again. This is costly for people from Crimea. That's why the number of people who voted in the national elections during these periods, it was less than we would like it to be. Also, the situation with the presidential elections of 2019 was nearly the same. About 5,000 voted. And the information component is really important here. Despite the efforts of NGOs, they spoke about it. They call on people to come to vote, to change the registration. But there was no proper information campaign by the state. Local elections. In 2015, NGOs said that IDPs should have opportunity to vote in communities that they joined. There were many manipulations by individual politicians and political forces who said that people will come en masse from the occupied territories, and this will influence drastically on the results of elections. And Maria said it correctly. Even if we are speaking about numbers, this looks like manipulation, not the real situation we face. But this year, the residents of the occupied territories, both from Crimea and Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts, they got opportunity to vote in local elections. Those who moved from these territories. This is really important aspect, political aspect, because when we are saying that those who moved out of occupied territories, they are full-fledged citizens in our country, they should have the same rights, political rights, as everyone else. About the research and what is important about it, I would mention several things. This is manipulation by occupation authorities, not really massive as it was in Transnistria when they manipulated they said that the residents of the occupied territories, they may go and vote in elections in Moldova and vote pro-Russian candidates. And there was no such efficient rhetorics because not many people were going. About separate districts. This question was discussed repeatedly about representation in the parliament. At the moment, this issue is not implemented. Starting 2014, for example, Crimean Tatars, or those people who have their origin in Crimea, these people discussed this issue with the separate political forces. And in different lists of political parties, there are some candidates from Crimea. But this does not influence a lot. This issue should be worked on more, taking into account all those problems that they had in Moldova, and we should take into account those manipulations that they had there. Also, I would like to speak about voting lists, and in the report this information was provided in 2014 on voters lists. 1.8 million people were included, and the register, it should have been updated, but 7 years passed of temporary occupation of Crimea. Many residents didn't reach their voting age. Now these people have this age, and it is really important that those people who didn't vote, they should be able to vote during the next elections in the controlled territories. One important aspect, and Maria mentioned this, we should simplify legislative norms in order that the residents of occupied territories be able to vote, but in controlled territories. This is really important for the residents of the occupied territories. And people should have this opportunity. I believe that Crimeans will use this opportunity, those who are pro-Ukrainian citizens. And taking into account previous experience, we see it clearly. Olga Aivazovska is given the floor. Thank you. A lot of topics have been raised. It is difficult to sum up. I would like to start with the feedback. About Russia. I believe Ukraine has done really a lot during this time concerning integration of IDPs and creation of conditions in order that people who live in the occupied territories be integrated in electoral process. This is about parliamentary and presidential elections, taking into account new system, proportional system. Participation is possible, and in this case, the parliament will have good representation, and there are some. And I would like also to speak about IDPs. I had negotiations in Minsk in the subgroup, and we should not organize this process in a non-controlled environment. And we should not organize these processes because it will contradict constitution of Ukraine, international standards, and there are framework agreements and legislation adopted by Ukrainian parliament. I speak about Copenhagen document and articles of constitution and NGOs and political parties that support the regime on non-controlled territories and use violence against our country's integrity. They should not be allowed. We should adhere to legislation. And Tamila, Tasheva and her Crimea SOS organization and OPORA network I work with, and there is there should be supremacy of law and human rights should be adhered to, and all citizens have their constitutional and election rights, and this should be done under jurisdiction of Ukraine. So the change of electoral address. In legislation, a normal period, all the citizens may choose their election address, even if you have address in occupied territories. Elsewhere, this procedure is different, not that we used during presidential elections. This is not temporary change. When, for example, you go on a business trip for 2 days and you want to vote during presidential elections, this is done once forever. You just change the address for the address where you live. If this address does not correspond to your formal registration. And there was a human dimension implementation meeting, and there were some haters campaigns against our organization because we want to reintegrate those citizens. We want to reintegrate people in the political processes. I believe that during 5 years there were tectonic changes in thinking of Ukrainian citizens concerning this issue. 5 years ago, this was a sensitive issue raised only by some human rights defenders. Now this is the law, and everyone who wants it, could change their vote as registration. 5 days before the start of campaign, you won't be able to do this. You should do it in advance. So there should be proper rules of law where the institution works. They have proper responsibilities, CEC, state register, and others. And Russia was always against any political processes through creation of special conditions for IDPs. They believe that these people who fled territories controlled by Russia, they do not have the right to participate in local elections after the occupation because they fled the territory. And also about elections as a key to reintegration. I believe that our colleagues from Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine, during the last local elections, we see that elections, they are conflicts. This is their nature. There should be proper cycle stages of demilitarization, deoccupation, and the territory should be returned maybe through different international institutions, and elections, they are at the end of reintegration process, not at the beginning. And when we had this opportunity to change voters' address before New Year in 2019, one of the ministers of the Cabinet of Ministers, parliamentarians, and top officials declared that we had a wave of migration to the territory controlled by the state, but this was not right. Statistically, official sources showed that there was a drop. This was New Year, and post-New Year, this was these were holidays. The number of people who crossed checkpoints decreased. And I would like to comment on Maria's speech. She is completely right that Ukraine did a lot, but there is a problem of logistics, and there is a question of haters. Should we create conditions in order to create this wave of hating if we do not have a platform to have a political campaign? And this is the elections to the councils in the Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. If the parliament would follow the position of the Russian Federation that was provided to Ukrainian deputies to change resolution concerning local elections to include Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast councils, then the wave of the interest to Ukrainian policy and elections from the authorities of the temporarily occupied territories of part of population that may be mobilized in different ways, this would appear as a problem for the national elections in Ukraine. This is not a motive to actively use those opportunities that are envisaged in the Ukrainian legislation. Also, Maria mentioned about the number of crossings per day. This is may come not for a day. They may have a logistical campaign, but do we need this? The influence of these groups during presidential elections won't be big, and in the local elections we do not need these people at all. So there may be a referendum that may be organized concerning some topics, but there may be an initiative from different political groups, and there is legislation for this instrument, or elections to oblast councils in the Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts. Serhiy mentioned the voters abroad. So the nature of these voters is different. This is not about access to media. Out of 4 million people, citizens of Ukraine, who live abroad, the big percentage of these people, they are there not for long, and maybe you are abroad, you should have the right to vote on election day. Also, access to media, access of candidates to these voters. In Ukrainian legislation, there is a limit. You cannot use foreign mass media for campaigning. This is post-Soviet norm, but it gives opportunity not to use mass media of Russian Federation for propaganda in the territory of Ukraine. But in elections, 60% of talk shows, they concern elections. If we are speaking about election campaign 2019, if we use the formula that creates conditions for controlled environment during elections, this is not cyber, because there are 3 countries in the world that use the cyber security: the USA, China, and the Russian Federation, and we do not have opportunities to counteract. If there is a wish, if the Russia wants to use cyberspace, they will do it. So there should be physical voting through consulates, diplomatic institutions, and the number is limited. What can be done? We may broaden logistical network, and we may also help people to work using early voting. We may extend the period of voting. The same may be done concerning voting for some groups, if we are speaking about some extraordinary elections in the territory of Ukraine. Summing up, it is rather difficult to sum up. Democracy is not something that is implemented in authoritarian and democratic and transitional societies. The standards of elections, they are the same for the territories where there are occupied territories or IDPs. Equal conditions not only for voters but also for candidates and participants of elections that have passive voting rights. Not only the voter should have the right of access to the media that should be equal, but also the candidates should have equal access to the voters. Otherwise, this is not real elections, and real is included in the Articles of Human Rights Convention. The real elections are elections that are elections in the conditions of free political will. So time is lacking. So I didn't exceed time limits, actually. So I would like to have some short remarks from our speakers.
I would like to insert the idea from Moldova. In Moldova, it is allowed to open polling stations beyond the diplomatic institutions in other countries. They create the election commissions, they delegate government officials to these election commissions, but this allowed to include diaspora more proactively, while Ukrainian embassy in Paris and some consulate generals try to do this. But in Strasbourg, we cannot organize polling stations because we have no consulate. In Moldova, they managed to create more than 20 polling stations. This allows to balance the numbers of voters from non-controlling territories with pro-Western pro-Western voters from diaspora. This is the question to Ukrainian participants of discussion. For non-Ukrainian participants of our discussions, I would ask you to make your warning, what we should try to prevent from your bad experience very quickly. the maximum extra-terrain voters recently was 75,000 against up to 65,000 in the old past. The idea how to open more polling stations abroad to allow access to the parties, access to the election commissions. If the parties have access to the election commissions abroad, then this removes actually all the problems with consulates, etc. I believe that Ukrainian citizens, up to 4 million living abroad, they have the right to vote in Ukrainian elections, and we have to think about them. I agree with Olga, there won't be no battles between me and her opinion. We should not create special conditions for voting in the occupied territories, and we should devote more attention to diaspora abroad, because the diaspora feels themselves deprived from their motherland in terms of elections. Tamila, do you have any ideas as to this? As for diaspora voters from Ukrainian diasporas, I agree with Olga that separate polling stations this issue should be studied, and I mean the occupied territories, the balance between good balance between opportunity to vote and the security issues for the residents of occupied territories. Natalka, I fully agree with Olga when she was interrupted that provision of fully democratic elections is not only the right to voters but also for the participants of the vote. That is for the candidates. We should ensure the possibility for political parties, and this is quite often is omitted. Those who fight for the rights and stand for the rights of the residents in occupied territories, they do not stand for the rights of the candidates and the right of the voters to make well-informed decision. This should be looked at very comprehensively and in a union. Pavel, will you present the Moldovan mistakes or warn us against any negative things? I fully agree with Olga that alternative ways of voting should be developed, and this will influence the participation not only the residents of occupied territories but also the residents of from diaspora and even inside the country. But thinking about alternative ways to vote, we should strongly connect it with the voluntary and preliminary registration in order to prevent any negative technologies on the election day. Paata, your turn, the mic. I would like to thank for participation in this discussion. In Georgia, we have the problems not only with the election but also with the human rights, and in Ukraine, when you have such a big number of Ukrainian citizens staying beyond the territory of Ukraine, and this is a threat of manipulation and abuse, which makes Ukraine much different from Georgia. In Ukraine, in Georgia now we are in big crisis because of the elections, and now we are discussing the internet voting, and here the security of internet becomes a bigger factor, and this is not because of Abkhazia and Ossetia, but because of internal Georgian problems, and we are your neighbors. And perhaps we may start doing that. Russian manipulations remain the threat, and we have all of us, we have to think carefully, keeping that in mind. I would like to thank to all the participants. We will try to sum up the elections. I have to apologize for interrupting you, because the next event is on agenda. I am grateful to UCMC and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation who allowed this project to happen. Thank you.